The night after the funeral, when grief should have been the only thing filling the house, Dorothy Hayes realized she was about to lose everything. At 74, still dressed in black, still moving through rooms that echoed with her husband's absence, Dorothy sat quietly as her daughter, Vanessa Hayes, spoke in a calm, measured tone that sounded like care, but felt like something else entirely. "The house is too much for you now," Vanessa said gently, placing a stack of papers in front of her. "You need somewhere safer, somewhere with support." Each sentence sounded reasonable, thoughtful, even loving, and Dorothy, exhausted, grieving, her mind still drifting between memories and disbelief, nodded without question. She didn't read carefully. She didn't argue. She trusted, because for a lifetime she had built everything around that trust. Years of sacrifice, double shifts, sleepless nights, a life shaped entirely around her family, believing that in the end, that love would return when she needed it most. But grief has a way of clouding judgment, and Vanessa knew it. She chose her moment carefully, the days right after the funeral, when the house still smelled of flowers, when Dorothy's thoughts came and went like distant echoes, when reality itself felt heavy and unclear. By the time the documents were signed, everything had already been decided, and 3 days later, when strangers walked into her home without knocking, measuring walls, discussing renovations, speaking as if it already belonged to them, Dorothy finally understood this wasn't help. It was control, and she had signed it away herself. The realization didn't arrive all at once. For Dorothy Hayes, it came slowly, like a quiet weight pressing down until it could no longer be ignored. At first, she tried to hold on to what Vanessa had told her, that it was for her safety, that the house was too much, that moving somewhere with care would make things easier. Each explanation sounded reasonable on its own, but together, they began to feel rehearsed, carefully placed. By the third day, the truth revealed itself, not through words, but through action. Strangers moved through her home without hesitation, carrying clipboards and measuring tapes, speaking in low, practical tones about renovations, timelines, and structural changes. They didn't knock. They didn't ask permission. They didn't even acknowledge her presence. They walked through the house like it already belonged to them. Dorothy stood in the hallway, her hands slightly trembling at her sides, confusion slowly replacing the numbness that had followed her since the funeral. She turned to Vanessa, her voice fragile but steady enough to ask, "What is this?" Vanessa didn't hesitate. "The house has been transferred, Mom," she said calmly. "It's already in process." The words felt distant at first, technical, cold, until they settled into something real. This wasn't a discussion. It wasn't a suggestion. It was done. Final. And suddenly everything that had felt like care revealed itself as something else entirely. Every soft word, every reassuring smile, every rushed signature. A step toward this exact moment. Dorothy's chest tightened as the weight of it settled over her. She hadn't just agreed to something. She had signed away her home, her stability, the last piece of the life she had built with her husband. And when she tried to speak, tried to ask why, the words wouldn't come. Not because she didn't have questions, but because the answer was already standing in front of her. Calm, certain, unmoved. And for the first time in her life, Dorothy understood something she had never imagined she would face. Trust, when used this quietly, can take everything without making a sound. They gave her 7 days, just 1 week for Dorothy Hayes to dismantle a lifetime. At 74, she moved through her own home like a stranger, opening drawers she had filled decades ago, touching objects that no longer felt like they belonged to her. Every item carried a memory: quiet mornings with her husband, long evenings filled with familiar routines, moments that once felt permanent but now slipped through her hands as something she could no longer keep. A chipped mug near the sink, a coat still hanging by the door, a photograph tucked behind a mirror, capturing a version of her life that felt impossibly distant. She packed slowly, not because she didn't understand the urgency, but because every decision felt final. What to take? What to leave? What could fit into a few boxes? And what would be lost forever? Vanessa didn't help. She said it would be too emotional, but Dorothy understood the truth. Her daughter had already moved on, already stepped into the next version of her life, one where this house was no longer a home, but an asset. By the final night, the rooms echoed, furniture gone, walls bare, silence stretching where warmth once lived. Dorothy walked through each space one last time, not just saying goodbye, but trying to understand how it had all disappeared so quickly. How something built over decades could be taken apart in days. How trust had turned into loss without resistance. And then she stopped at the back hallway, a part of the house she rarely thought about. There, almost invisible against the wall, was a narrow door painted the same color, blending in so perfectly it had never asked for attention. She stared at it longer than she meant to, trying to remember if she had ever opened it, if it had ever mattered. But strangely, she couldn't. Only a faint memory surfaced, her husband mentioning it once, dismissing it in a way that didn't match his usual careful nature. And now, standing in the quiet aftermath of everything she had lost, something inside Dorothy shifted. Not grief, not anger, curiosity. A small, persistent feeling that maybe there was still something in this house that hadn't been taken. Something Vanessa didn't know about. Something hidden in plain sight. And for the first time since the funeral, Dorothy stepped toward something that wasn't decided for her, but chosen. Dorothy didn't sleep that night. The image of the narrow door stayed with her, pulling at something she hadn't felt since before the funeral: instinct. By morning, while the house stood half empty and unfamiliar, Dorothy Hayes moved with a quiet sense of purpose. Not rushed, not frantic, but guided by something deeper than thought. She began searching. Drawers she hadn't opened in years, boxes tucked into forgotten corners, places that made no logical sense, except to a memory that felt more like a whisper than a fact. And then she stopped. At her husband's desk. It was the one thing Vanessa hadn't asked her to pack yet. Dorothy hesitated, her fingers resting lightly on the worn wood. That desk had always been his space, ordered in a way only he understood, private without needing to be explained. Opening it now felt different, like stepping into a conversation he had never finished. She searched carefully, moving through each drawer, each compartment, until something caught her attention. A subtle unevenness, not visible, but felt. Dorothy leaned down, her breath catching as she examined the underside of the desk. And there it was, a small key, taped carefully where no one would think to look. Old, worn, but intentional. Her hand trembled slightly as she removed it, the metal cool against her skin. And suddenly, a memory returned. His voice, years ago, calm, certain. Some things don't need to be explained right away. You'll understand when you have to. Back then, she had smiled and let it pass, trusted him without needing more. But now, standing alone in a house that was no longer hers. Those words felt different. Prepared. Left behind for this exact moment. Dorothy closed her fingers around the key and walked back toward the narrow door, her steps slow but steady. She paused in front of it, not out of fear, but because she understood something now. Whatever lay behind that door could change everything, or nothing at all. But either way, she needed to know. And with a quiet breath, she slid the key into the lock, turned it, and heard the soft click that changed everything. The door opened slowly, as if it had been waiting for this moment. A faint rush of cool air met Dorothy Hayes, carrying with it the stillness of something hidden for years. She stood there for a second, her hand still on the handle, her breath quiet but uneven as she looked into the darkness beyond. It wasn't a closet. It wasn't storage. A narrow staircase stretched downward. Dorothy reached for the light switch along the wall, her fingers brushing against it before pressing it down. One by one, dim lights flickered on below, revealing something that made her tighten her grip on the railing just to steady herself. Because this wasn't a basement, not in any ordinary sense. It was an apartment, fully built, carefully arranged, as if it had been waiting. She moved down the stairs slowly, each step echoing softly as the details came into view. A small kitchen stood neatly organized, utensils placed with quiet intention. A bed, made and untouched, as though someone had prepared it and simply left. Shelves lined with preserved supplies, still intact despite the years. Even electricity still flowed, casting a warm, steady light across the space. Nothing here felt rushed. Nothing felt accidental. Everything spoke of time, of planning, of purpose. Dorothy stepped further inside, her eyes searching for something, anything that could explain why this existed beneath her own home. And then she saw it, a single envelope, placed neatly on a wooden table, her name written on it in her husband's familiar handwriting. Her breath caught, because that handwriting meant something now. Final. Words she would never hear spoken aloud again. She hesitated, her fingers hovering just above it. Then, slowly, she picked it up. Because deep down, she already understood. This wasn't just a hidden space. It was a message, left behind for the moment she needed it most. Dorothy sat down slowly, the envelope resting in her hands, as if it carried more than just paper. For a moment, she didn't open it. Because once she did, everything would change. But something deeper than hesitation pushed her forward. Carefully, Dorothy Hayes unfolded the letter. The handwriting was steady, familiar, and with the first few lines, something inside her shifted. He wasn't just explaining the apartment. He was explaining why it existed. Her eyes moved slowly across the page, each word settling heavier than the last. He wrote about building this space over years, quietly, carefully, making sure it remained separate from the main property in every legal way that mattered. Separate, untouchable, registered solely in her name. Dorothy's breath caught as the meaning took hold. This place didn't belong to the house her daughter had taken. It belonged to her, completely. He had anticipated something. Not the exact moment, not the exact reason, but the possibility. That one day someone might try to make decisions for her, might see the house not as a home, but as an asset, something to be controlled, taken. And he had refused to leave her vulnerable to that, even if it meant keeping this from her until she needed it most. Tears blurred Dorothy's vision, not from grief this time, but from something deeper. Understanding. Because what he had given her wasn't just a hidden apartment, it was a choice. A way to remain independent when everything else had been taken. A place no one could force her out of, no matter what papers had been signed upstairs. Dorothy folded the letter slowly, placing it back on the table with care. And for the first time since the funeral, something inside her steadied. She wasn't powerless, not completely. Because while the world above had already moved on without her, this space below still belonged to her. For 3 days, Dorothy Hayes lived beneath her own home without anyone knowing. Above her, footsteps echoed through rooms that once held her memories. Voices spoke casually about tearing down walls, repainting spaces, reshaping everything into something new. Workers moved freely, measuring, planning, deciding, as if her life had already been erased. But below, everything remained still, untouched. Hers. There was something quietly powerful in that contrast, as if the life that had rejected her existed in one world, while the one that still belonged to her existed in another. Dorothy moved through the small apartment slowly, adjusting to its rhythm. She didn't rush. She didn't react. For the first time since the funeral, she wasn't being guided or pushed. She was choosing, and so she waited. Not out of fear, but out of understanding, because she knew something the others did not. It didn't take long for the shift to begin. On the 4th day, the tone above changed. No longer calm, no longer controlled. Voices grew sharper, uneven, threaded with confusion. Words filtered through the ceiling, records, ownership, discrepancy, repeated in tense, uncertain tones, followed by questions no one seemed able to answer. Dorothy paused mid-step, her breath steady, her expression calm. Because she already knew. She had read it in the letter. This apartment wasn't part of the house that had been transferred. It had never been. And now that truth was rising, slowly, inevitably, into the world above, through confusion, through complication, through a problem no one had expected. By the end of the day, the house had shifted, from certainty to doubt. Plans stalled, voices lowered, control began to slip, and Dorothy, standing quietly in the space her husband had left for her, didn't feel anger. She didn't feel satisfaction, only something steadier. Balance. Because for the first time since everything had been taken from her, something was beginning to return. Dorothy didn't rush. She waited until the voices above softened into an uneasy silence, until confusion had fully replaced certainty. Then, with calm, deliberate steps, Dorothy Hayes walked toward the staircase. This time, she wasn't hiding. She was revealing. The door creaked open, the sound cutting through the quiet upstairs almost immediately. Within seconds, footsteps approached, quick at first, then slowing, uncertain, as if something unseen had already begun to shift. And then, Vanessa appeared at the top of the stairs. She froze. Her eyes moved across the space below, confusion turning into disbelief in an instant. The apartment, the fully built, carefully preserved space beneath the house, didn't fit into anything she thought she understood. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them carried more weight than any argument. Then Vanessa's voice broke through, lower now, stripped of its earlier certainty. "What is this?" Dorothy looked up at her, calm, steady, not angry, not accusing, certain. "It's mine." 2 words, simple, final, and they landed with a force no explanation could soften. Because they weren't just about the space itself. They were about everything Vanessa had assumed she controlled, every decision, every paper, every plan. In that moment, something shifted, not through confrontation, but through clarity. Vanessa stepped back slightly, her expression tightening as questions began to rise, fast, layered, edged with frustration. Why hadn't she known? Why wasn't it disclosed? Why hadn't Dorothy said anything? But Dorothy didn't rush to answer. She let the silence settle first. "This wasn't yours to know," she said quietly. And that was when the truth became undeniable. The house above, the sale, the transfer, the plans was no longer complete. Everything now revolved around something Vanessa could not control, something she could not take. And Dorothy didn't need to fight for it, because it had already been secured, long before anyone thought to look. The days that followed were quiet, but no longer uncertain. For the first time since the funeral, Dorothy Hayes was no longer reacting to decisions made for her. She was living within something no one else could take on her own terms, in a space that belonged only to her. Above, everything had changed. The confident voices were gone, replaced by careful discussions and delayed plans. What had once moved quickly now stalled, tangled in complications no one had expected. The house was no longer simple to sell, no longer easy to reshape, no longer fully theirs, and that changed everything. Dorothy moved through the small apartment with a steady rhythm, arranging things the way she wanted, choosing her own routine, her own pace. She listened to the world above without feeling pulled into it. For the first time, she wasn't being managed. She wasn't being placed somewhere convenient. She was simply living. Vanessa came back more than once, but each visit was different, quieter, more careful. Gone was the calm certainty that had once guided every word. In its place was hesitation, a recognition that something fundamental had shifted, something she could no longer control. Dorothy didn't argue. She didn't accuse. She didn't revisit the past. She listened when Vanessa spoke, answered when necessary, but she didn't step back into the role that had been decided for her, because she didn't need to. The balance had already been restored, not through conflict, but through something far more powerful: limits. And as the tension above slowly gave way to acceptance, Dorothy understood something with complete clarity. Her daughter had taken the visible parts of her life, the house, the documents, the control. But she had never understood where the real power truly lay, because the one thing that mattered most had never been hers to take. In the weeks that followed, Dorothy Hayes no longer felt like a woman who had lost everything. She felt like someone who had finally found what could never be taken. The house above still stood, filled with plans, conversations, and decisions that no longer belonged to her. Workers came and went. Papers were discussed. Choices were made. But none of it reached her the way it once would have. Because beneath it all, in the quiet apartment her husband had built with care and intention, Dorothy created something new. A life that was hers alone. She arranged the space slowly, deliberately, not to impress anyone, but to feel at home in a way she never had before. She chose when to wake, when to rest, when to speak, and when to remain silent. There were no voices guiding her, no pressure to become something she wasn't, just clarity. And for the first time in a long while, that was enough. Dorothy no longer measured her life by what had been taken from her. She no longer replayed the moment she signed those papers or searched for a different outcome. Because what she had now was something deeper, stronger, unbreakable: her independence. It didn't come loudly. It didn't need to be proven. It simply existed, steady, quiet, and entirely her own. And as the days settled into a rhythm she had chosen for herself, Dorothy understood something she had never truly felt before. Losing everything had not been the end. It had been the moment she finally discovered what was truly hers. In the quiet that followed, Dorothy Hayes no longer felt like a woman who had been pushed out of her own life. She felt grounded, steady, certain in a way she had never been before. Days passed, then weeks, and the world above slowly moved on, plans adjusted, conversations softened, control no longer absolute. But below, in the space that had been quietly protected for her all along, Dorothy built something far more meaningful than what she had lost. She built freedom. Not the kind that comes from escape, but the kind that comes from knowing no one else can decide your life for you. She no longer waited for approval, no longer feared being left behind. Because for the first time, she understood something clearly. What truly belongs to you can never be taken in a moment of weakness. And in that realization, Dorothy didn't just regain control. She found herself. Sometimes, the people we trust the most can hurt us the deepest. Not loudly, not suddenly, but quietly through decisions we didn't fully understand until it was too late. And when everything feels lost, that's when the truth appears. Because real power isn't in what people give you. It's in what remains when they try to take everything away. If this story touched your heart, tell me in the comments. Have you ever faced a moment where everything seemed lost, but you found strength you didn't know you had? And don't forget to subscribe, because sometimes the next story might be the one that helps you take your power back.